Hello, and thanks for joining us for part two of our study of angels. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into this subject and learn a few hopefully interesting things about angels. Now, we're going to begin with the first mention of an angelic being in Scripture. And it's always useful to look at the first mention of something, and this is no exception. We're going to look at the first occurrence in Genesis 3:24, where it says, God drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. You probably know this story, but you might not have realized cherubims were placed at the entrance to guard it and to prevent Adam and Eve from coming back into the garden. So this is the first type of angel we're going to study. It's the plural cherubim, or in the singular, the cherub. And we mentioned what a cherub was last study in part one. And kind of a footnote here, I realize cherubim are not actually angels. They're not called angels in the Bible, but we're going to include them in this study of angels because they are part of the group of creatures that we should probably say celestial creatures or maybe angelic creatures. They're kind of lumped in with these other strange and interesting supernatural entities. And here we have a woodcut depiction of what the artist thought a cherub looked like, with the flaming sword and Adam and Eve right there. But we're going to look at the cherub in some detail here. So what can we learn from this first mention, from this verse we just looked at? There are a few things that we can glean from it. And when you read between the lines, you can realize things that might not be evident on a first reading of a scripture. So here, one of the things we can learn is that the cherubim's purpose was to be a guard or a sentinel. That's important. A cherub, or the word cherub, may come from a word meaning to guard, in fact. So one of the things we know from that is they're probably imposing. They're like bouncers. They are frightening, or they are intimidating, and likely they're capable of aggressive actions too. Another thing that we learn, and it's obvious, but let's mention it, is that cherubims are placed by the Lord God in this incident. Therefore, these creatures are in the service of God. That's one of the implications of that. So in this capacity, they were enforcing limitations or boundaries as far as the Garden of Eden and where man, Adam and Eve at the time, could or could not go. And there could be other ways that cherubim are employed by God. This is the only thing in this particular passage that we can really glean from it, from what they are doing. Another implication, though, is because the cherubims were placed by God, it means that they came from his realm. It doesn't seem that they originally lived on earth or that they stayed on the earth, but they were placed there, so they came from heaven or from another realm that humans weren't part of. And another thing is that it appears God entrusts them, or entrusted them, with the garden as custodians. They were keeping it. So a few things there that, when you think about them, they're in the passage, they're just not what we would think of on first reading. Another thing that is interesting, and you might have noticed it, there's a flaming sword in this passage. The sword seems to be a separate item that behaves independently of them, the way it's written. But probably more likely it would be that one of the cherubims wielded the sword. Since the cherubims had a sword, which is a deadly weapon, and since they were there to prevent access to the tree of life, the implication is they would kill somebody if they tried to get past the cherubim. So therefore, another assumption we can make is that cherubims are capable of killing human life. That didn't happen to Adam and Eve. Presumably they just walked away and they didn't try to get back into the garden, but the flaming sword was there for a reason. It was a prominent part of the cherubims guarding the east of Eden. And we're not told if perhaps maybe there were other things going on there, but that's enough. And it's interesting to think about a flaming sword. Have you ever seen a flaming sword? That's not an everyday item. So you have to imagine it. You have to think, what does it look like? Well, you might have seen it without realizing it in popular media. So here's what a flaming sword might look like if such a thing was real. We've all seen these flaming swords. So yes, you've seen a flaming sword. This is I guess a laser or something else like that, but I would call it a flaming sword in Star Wars. One of the most famous sword battles. And this guy actually made a flaming sword. You should check out his video. He made an ingenious design, and it looks pretty cool. So flaming swords aren't totally fantasy. It could exist. I don't know how practical it is, but in the supernatural realm, there are things that we can't imagine, and the cherubim had a flaming sword. So, as interesting as the flaming sword is, this mysterious weapon isn't really relevant to us, at least in this age after Jesus was crucified and rose again. And here's a bit of a Greek Orthodox hymn. It says, "Now the flaming sword no longer guards the gates of paradise. It has been mysteriously quenched by the wood of the cross. The sting of death and the victory of hell have been vanquished. For you, my Savior, came and cried to those in hell, enter again into paradise." So this brief excerpt from a Greek Orthodox hymn does make a good point. It says, the flaming sword no longer guards the gates of paradise. The gates of paradise are open for anyone who places faith in Jesus. And Jesus made that clear to the thief on the cross. You just have to believe in Jesus. And he wants everybody to go into heaven. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should have eternal life. But back to the subject of these creatures. What do cherubim look like? Well, according to my count, with the help of Bible search software, there are 95 instances of the words cherub or cherubim in the Bible. And most of these occur in passages talking about the Ark of the Covenant. And on top of that Ark, there were golden cherubs. So one of those verses in Exodus says, "Thou shalt make 2 cherubims of gold." And it describes them a little bit. It says that they have wings, and it says that they are looking at each other. Their faces shall look one to another. So the wings were known, or they were at least, there was some way that the artist knew what to sculpt out of gold. And there were faces, and the artist had to know somewhat how to craft those faces. So it's interesting. What did God do to reveal how a cherub looked to the person who made those golden cherubs? Well, here's one depiction of what that ark might look like, or might have looked like. We're not told how the artist knew what the cherubs looked like, but this is pretty close to how it is described in the Bible. And from those verses, we can learn a few more things. Not only did people know what they looked like, but they're winged creatures with faces, and we're going to describe or explore that and describe that a bit more. But another thing we're going to learn about further is they surround or guard the throne of God. Since the Lord speaks from between the 2 cherubims, and because the Bible tells us that everything he instructed Moses to make was a shadow of heavenly things in Hebrews, this tells us that cherubims flank the sides of the throne of God in heaven. In addition to that, King Hezekiah prays to God as he which dwelleth between the cherubims. Not only were the golden cherubs made for the mercy seat of the ark, but cherubs were embroidered into the design of the tabernacle curtains. There are a few things in the tabernacle that are supernatural in nature. They are the shadow of, or the representation of things that exist in heaven, and the cherubims are no different. Solomon's temple prominently featured the cherubim. He placed two very massive cherubim statues in the Holy of Holies, also called the Oracle, and he had carved cherubim figures throughout the temple, including on the doors. And if you read those passages, you can learn more about that. But the proportions are 10 cubits high and 5 cubits long for a cherub wing and for the height of the statue. I have to ask, why were cherubims placed on the ark and as carvings and embroidered designs throughout the temple? Well, my idea about that is it has something to do with guarding the things of God. And that's probably their primary purpose. They're God's guardians. That's why they're on the sides of his throne. That's why they guarded the gates of Eden. And cherubims actually were widely known in ancient times in that role, in the role of a guard. Other cultures, besides the Hebrew culture, had similar creatures in their religion. And they depicted those creatures in their temples. And I'll tell you about just a few of them, and we'll look at a few images of those. So in ancient Egypt and Greece, we'll start there because you know about one of those, and it's the Sphinx. That's a very close approximation of a cherubim in their culture. It's the most similar thing to what the Bible talks about as a cherubim. But India also has their own guardian creature. They had the Sharabha and the Ganda Berunda, which was part lion, part human, part mammal, and part bird. Remember that because we're going to talk about that a bit more. Sri Lanka has the Narasimha, or the human lion, and that creature had the body of a lion and the head of a man. Not exactly a cherubim, but similar. And in Persia, or what today we call Iran, the Gopat, or the Gopayitosha. It's a similar creature, again, a winged bull or a lion with a human face. So all these, Sphinx and these other ones, have some similarities. They're not the same exact creature, but they're usually a mixture of creatures, and often they're winged. And then there's another one, the manticore, or man-eater. That's a Persian hybrid creature, similar to the Sphinx. And here are a few pictures of these creatures. Not real pictures, not photographs, but pictures of sculptures. This is an Iranian bronze in the form of a gopat, which we just mentioned. That's in Cleveland in their Museum of Art. So it has wings, and it's a kind of like it looks like a cattle type of creature. This is a gopat on a golden drinking cup from Iran. So it looks like it has a human face, the body of a lion, and then wings. And then here is an Indian Purushamriga, or a sphinx, guarding the entrance of a temple. Again, these were guardian creatures, no matter what culture we look at. Here's a sphinx from Nola, Italy, and this is the 5th century BC. So the face or the head of human, lion's body, and wings. A Greek sphinx from Delphi. So why am I bringing this up? Why is this significant or important that there are these cherubim or similar to cherubim throughout the world? Well, again, it shows that these creatures, they were known. They were common knowledge, actually. And that was either through a shared human experience, meaning like a legend was passed down, perhaps directly from Adam and Eve, and then the legend got changed a bit through the years, or somebody had seen them. But another thing we can realize is that people knew these creatures were connected to God, whatever their concept of God was. And what's interesting is that because these all have some similarities, it does give us a clue as to what these things looked like. These were not all made up experiences at random. There was a connection, or there wouldn't be any commonalities. And this can inform us or give us a closer idea of what the ark and the temple cherubim looked like. Now, these are interdimensional creatures, but the interesting thing again is ancient cultures knew what these interdimensional entities looked like. I have to ask how. My conclusion is if it wasn't just from a passed down legend, these people in these ancient times used to see these things. These things would appear visibly to humans on Earth. Maybe it was a rare thing, but I think it happened, and it doesn't seem to be happening anymore. Well, let's look at another depiction. Since we don't have Solomon's temple to look at, let's look at a temple that was in existence at around the same time. This is called the Ain Dara temple that we're going to look at. It's a Syro-Hittite temple, noted for its similarities to Solomon's temple in the Bible. The site of this temple is located near the village of Ain Dara in Syria, and it existed from 1300 BC until about 740 BC. And it then became in disuse, but remained almost unchanged during the construction of Solomon's temple. This is it. This is what is the most recent picture of its remains. So that's the site of it. What's interesting, though, is what is on the walls of it. If you look at the bottom, you'll see that there are some creatures in the rock carved there. Here's a closer view of one of them. That is, to me, similar to a cherub. So that has a face of a human, wings, body of a lion, it seems. And there were other carvings like this surrounding that entire temple. Unfortunately, though, we can't see this any longer because a lot of it was destroyed in an airstrike just a few years ago. Here's another creature called the Lamassu from Assyria. And again, human head, bull body, eagle's wings. And that word Lamassu means a protective spirit. So I might call that a guardian. And here is a cherub on an Neo-Assyrian seal. This is much closer to what the Bible actually describes, as we will see. And that brings us to Ezekiel's description of the cherubs. So it's interesting to see what other cultures interpreted a cherub to be and the other creatures they had in their religions, but those might be totally wrong. Or another possibility is those were correct, but they were depictions of entirely different entities, similar but different entities. So let's look at Ezekiel 10 for a more full description. This passage is the only human description of a cherub that I know of, and what's more, this is by a prophet of God, and it's recorded in the Bible, so I take this as authoritative. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but I highlighted some of the main parts here that contain details that I think are important for our discussion and our study. You can read the chapter on your own, and I do recommend it, but for the moment, we're just going to look at a few of these highlighted words and talk about what they mean. We see wheels, we see cherub, coals of fire are mentioned, wings are mentioned, fire again is mentioned. A cherub has a hand, he stretches forth his hand, and it says further that there's a form of a man's hand under their wings. So I don't know if that was exactly like a human hand or just similar, but it says it's the form of a man's hand. And again, the wheels are mentioned. And it says they four had one likeness. There are 4 cherubs in this passage, and what I believe this is saying is that they all look identical. Overall, they are clones of one another, for lack of a better term. It mentions that they're full of eyes round about, and they have 4 faces, which is interesting. So if you can imagine the head of one of these creatures, it says the first face was the face of a cherub, and the sides of it and the back were different faces. The second was the face of a man, then a lion, then an eagle. And they're given the name of a living creature. He refers to them as a living creature here, not just as a cherub. And we know that they have 4 wings. These are all things we can get from Ezekiel chapter 10. So we know that there are noises, they're flapping wings, so the wings move. I mentioned the hands. The wheels are something we'll talk about briefly. They don't always seem to be accompanied by the wheels, but the wheels are a very common presence with the cherubs. And the eyes are interesting. It implies that the eyes are all over their bodies, so they don't just have 2 eyes. They don't even have 8 eyes on the head. They have eyes all over, I think. It doesn't really make it clear. What's weird, if it wasn't a weird enough creature with wings, is it has 4 faces, and they're different types of animals. All these things are just intriguing to me, and it would look terrifying if you saw this creature. This is one artist's depiction of what it might have looked like, and this is an ancient piece of art, so it's not photorealistic, but it does help us a bit. We can see that there are 4 creatures' heads here, and there are wings, but it's hard to really get a clear picture of what this thing would look like from a picture like this. Ezekiel's description helps, but we simply haven't seen anything like this on our planet. At least most of us haven't. Ezekiel did. The wheels are a strange part of this. I've heard people think that the wheels are UFOs, and I've heard mention of that before, but that's not really the case. I don't believe that they're UFOs. They seem to be something almost living in their own right, and they are called Ophanim. They appear with the cherubim, and there are times when the cherubim seem to appear without them. So they're not inextricably linked, but they are friends. They appear together often. So they might be a different kind of angelic being, because that's what the book of Enoch talks about, and it's a possibility. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls equates them with angels, and the book of Enoch portrays them as a different class of celestial beings, along with the cherubim and seraphim, who we'll talk about soon. And it says that they never sleep, but they guard the throne of God. In angelology, they are one of the choirs or the classes of angels, and the other name of them is thrones. There's not a lot said about them, however, so much of what we know is very scant, and we're left to guess. But this is one of the artist's depictions of an Ophanim that I could find, and it just looks like wheels with eyes on fire. And if I saw something like that, I think I'd notice. Here's another depiction of what Ezekiel saw. So you see the tetramorph, and that's another name given to the cherub or the living creature. There's God's throne up above, and if you see that thing on the left, that would be the wheels. So this is an illustration by Matthäus Marian in his Icones Biblicae from the 1600s. Now, another passage dealing with this subject is where Ezekiel sees the cherubs in Ezekiel 1, and I've done the same thing here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to highlight the details. 4 living creatures having the likeness of a man. So I'm taking that to mean that there's a roughly human shape to their body. Again, 4 faces and 4 wings. We get another detail here, though. They have feet like calves, or hoofed feet. And they sparkle, so they're light. There is light coming off of them. Again, hands under the wings. And we have a description of their faces again, but this is an interesting parallel because it gives us a definition. There's the man, there's the lion, then it says ox and eagle. And if you remember from the other passage, it said cherub. It did not say ox. Therefore, it's not a contradiction, but what we are being told here is that a cherub is an ox, or they look equivalent. So maybe the true face of the cherub is that of an ox, or maybe that's the forward facing face. I'm not sure, but these parallel each other. So that fills in one of the questions that we have if we just read Ezekiel 10. It also says, though, that they have the appearance of lamps, and it connects them with burning coals of fire, and it says they're bright, and lightning comes out of them. So just know that there's a lot of light associated with these creatures. They are glowing, there's lightning coming out of them, they're bright. You can't miss them. And they're quick. The last sentence says the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. So they can basically teleport. It's a very interesting animal. If it's anything like an animal, it's a creature. So just to recap some of this, it had the likeness of a man, and it could mean that he initially saw the man's face, feet like a calf, and that might have gone upwards to the knee, sparkled, shined, etc. And they travel straight, which I think means they go in a straight line, and they can stand upright. Just a few details that we can glean from the passages. And here's another depiction of what it would have maybe looked like. So there's a human body and these different heads. These are entirely different heads, not just faces, but there's the wheel and there are some wings. And of course, something like this is open to artistic interpretation, and there's a lot of symbolism that goes along with these things in the Bible. There are times that take the Bible entirely symbolically, but there are also times when you have to interpret it just as what it says, literally. So if people ask, how do you interpret the Bible? I say, well, I interpret it symbolically when there are symbols being given, and I interpret it literally when it's a literal account of something. And I think with the cherubs in Ezekiel's vision, he's just describing what he sees. So I know a lot of this seems like cryptic symbolism, and some of these passages don't make a lot of sense on their own. But the thing with the Bible is these separated, nonsensical passages begin to make a lot more sense the more you connect them with other passages. And that brings me to another subject here, the lost cherub, I call him. So if you read Ezekiel 28, especially verses 11 through 19, you get more info about cherubs. It's indirect info, but it's there. There's a being who is spoken about, and he has some unusual characteristics. And I'm just going to briefly outline what they are, but I recommend that you read Ezekiel 28 for yourself. This creature was totally wise and beautiful. It says he was at one time in Eden. It says that, strangely, he was covered in precious stones and gold. I don't know if that means it was part of his being or if he was wearing jewelry, essentially, or maybe some kind of armor that had those coatings. He's called the anointed cherub that covered. And that word anointed is the same word that we use for Christ. That is what Christ means. It means anointed, or you might say the word christened, which of course contains the same root word for Christ. Well, this was an anointed creature. It was a type of Christ, you almost might say. It's not Jesus Christ, but it's an anointed creature. It says in this passage that he was in the holy mountain of God, but was cast out after he sinned, or he rebelled, which is what sin is. It's rebellion. It specifies that pride was this creature's downfall. And an interesting thing is that he has brightness. He is bright. He emits light. And we know that the cherubs do that same thing. And I'll bring up a couple of words here. In Spanish, we have the word luz, which means light. And in Italian, there's a word luce. And these have a connection. And you might have heard of a creature in the Bible that has light. He's a light bearer, and his name is Lucifer. So it could be that Lucifer is the lost cherub. And an interesting detail that you might have not thought about is that with the faces of the cherubs, the animal kingdoms are all represented except for reptiles or scaled creatures. And interestingly, Lucifer or Satan or the devil is always depicted as a dragon, a scaled creature. However, the cherubs that are around the throne of God don't have scales. So let's make kind of a footnote and place a bookmark here. It's something to be studied. I don't have the answers, but it's an interesting thing that I thought I'd bring up. Let's move on. When you read the book of Revelation, you're going to find that there are some beasts, living creatures, and they're described by John in a passage in Revelation and mentioned a few other times. So, a thing to ask is, are they the same type of creatures that Ezekiel saw? We'll look at that passage. Before the throne there was a sea of glass. In the midst of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts, full of eyes, just like the cherubs. First beast was like a lion, second like a calf, the third had the face of a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. So the same faces. The 4 beasts, each of them had 6 wings, and they were full of eyes. There's a difference. They have wings, but the number of wings is different. So they do have a lot of similarities with the cherubs, and I'm listing them here, but the wings are different. Interestingly, these things can speak because they worship God. They kneel before God. They are distinct from the angels. If you look at Revelation 5:11, you'll see that they are a different type of animal, a different type of celestial creature. And they're intelligent. They know the plans of God, and they speak according to his will. They're obedient to God. So I think that they're connected. They are not the same thing, though. The living creatures of Ezekiel were described slightly differently. They have a lot of commonalities, but these are the seraphim that we see in Revelation. And they appear in Revelation primarily, it seems, praising God. And like the cherubim, they are covered in eyes. They have the faces of a lion, ox, man, and eagle. But I don't know what they do beyond that. We don't know that they are maybe even a different type of creature that does different functions. So they appear here in Revelation. They're present in the end times, and they're connected with the worship of God and the pronouncements of God. So the critical distinction between them is their form. Like I said, the number of wings. The seraphim do appear in the book of Isaiah, and their name means burning ones. So seraphim use 2 of their wings for flying, and like the cherubim, they are among the highest order of angelic beings. We know, as far as the numbers, there are at least 4 cherubim. There could be more. It doesn't say that there are more, but there could be. There's no limitation that is pronounced. They don't seem to be as numerous as regular angels, going back to that name of an angel that we started this study with. These seem to be specialized creatures, and as such, there's only a few of them. So what are our final observations? Well, here are a couple of things. The 4 faces represent the 4 domains of God's rule. The man represents humanity, the lion, wild animals in general, the ox, domestic animals, and the eagle, birds. So obviously that doesn't include every single thing. Insects, for instance. What about fish? So it's a nice way to kind of represent the domains of God's rule, and this might be a valid interpretation. I'm not going to say this is or isn't right, but it's interesting to think about. Another interesting thing, though, is that the 4 faces correspond to the 4 Gospels. The lion, which would be seen as royalty, the king of the jungle, Leo the lion. In the Gospel of Matthew, which is written to the Jews, primarily this image is used to symbolize Jesus as the prophesied Messiah, the king that God promised to raise up to rule over Israel, the lion of the tribe of Judah. And then we have the ox. An ox is a beast of burden, so humility. The ox is a creature of great power, yet it humbly submits to the authority that tames and directs it. And this image also epitomizes Jesus, as described in the Gospel of Mark, just obedient to do the will of the Father. Then we have the third face, the man, which is, of course, humanity. And human nature is designed and based on God's own nature. We connect to God and we seek community with each other because that's how He created us. And Luke focuses on that, on Jesus's human nature. And then we have, finally, the eagle, divinity. The eagle is a symbol of God's divine nature. It soars above and His glory, and it represents John's gospel. John expounds upon Jesus, His divine nature, as God the Son. So each face is a picture of different facets of God's character and personality, and the cherubim portraying them all speaks to how God possesses each of them. Rather than separate roles, they're united in the person and being of God, and the angels merely reflect their Creator. So that concludes our study for this part 2 of angels, and I encourage you to stay around, come back for part 3. When I release part 3, I'd hope you hear about it. So if you want to hear about it, subscribe, and you'd really help me out if you'd like this video as well. And come back and visit, and hopefully we'll learn some even more interesting things in part 3 about angels. Thanks again.